I stood there, my hands trembling as I reached for the turkey. But it wasn't the bird I was focused on. My son's words still echoed in the air. "Don't break a hip, Mom." The insult cut deeper than the sharpest knife. But this time, it wasn't about my age or my health. This time, I was the one holding the power. And when I sat back down, I knew he'd never get his hands on what's mine. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The dining room glowed with golden light, the chandelier shimmering over the Thanksgiving table like a crown. Steam rose from the mashed potatoes, butter pooled on green beans, and the turkey sat in the middle, carved neatly by Brian with more show than skill. Everyone leaned in, laughing, reaching, filling plates. For a moment, it felt like the kind of picture that would end up on a holiday card, until Brian leaned back in his chair, fork tapping his plate, and smirked. "Careful, Mom," he said, voice loud enough to carry. "Don't break a hip reaching for the turkey." The words landed with a metallic clang. A pause hung in the air before Elaine chuckled, brittle and forced. "Oh, Brian," she said, dabbing her lips with her napkin. Always the comedian. Sophie, seated across the table, didn't laugh. Her fork hovered midair, eyes sharp, lips pressed tight. Marjorie, seated at the end, forced her smile into place the way one does when a flashbulb goes off, bright but empty. She reached for the gravy boat with steady hands, though her chest felt heavy, like someone had laid a stone inside her ribs. The scrape of chairs, the clink of cutlery, the hum of conversation crept back into the room, but something inside her had shifted. She lowered her eyes to her plate, carved a piece of turkey, and chewed carefully, slowly, until the laughter returned to its usual rhythm. Gloria, her oldest friend and neighbor, sat beside her as she always did when invited. She leaned in, her perfume faint but familiar, and murmured, "That wasn't a joke." That was a claim Marjorie didn't reply. She only tucked her napkin under her palm and reached into her sweater pocket. A small notebook, black with rounded corners, rested there. She flipped it open beneath the tablecloth, shielding it from sight. Her pen moved swiftly, a whisper against paper. November 23rd, Thanksgiving, Brian. Don't break a hip reaching for the turkey. She closed the notebook and placed it back into her pocket, her movements hidden under the shuffle of serving bowls. Dinner carried on. Sophie tried to spark conversation about her college classes. Elaine chattered about holiday shopping deals, and Brian went back to refilling his glass of wine. But Marjorie noticed how his eyes lingered on the walls, the windows, the ceiling beams, as though cataloging them, like a man rehearsing ownership. Later, after dessert plates were scraped clean and coffee mugs clattered against saucers, Marjorie excused herself. She moved slowly up the stairs, careful on the carpet runner that had been laid when Richard was still alive. Her hip didn't ache, her dignity did. From her bedroom doorway, she could hear the murmurs drifting up from below. Laughter, a cabinet door closing, the faint jingle of a bottle. She sat at her vanity, removed her earrings, and stared at her own reflection, steady, lined, but far from fragile. Then a whisper carried clearer than the rest. Brian's, voice sharp and unguarded, floated up the stairwell. "Once she's gone," he said, low but audible. "The house is ours." Elaine hushed him quickly, her words a muffled hiss. Sophie said nothing. Marjorie froze, her hand hovering above her jewelry box. She had lived long enough to know the difference between careless humor and intent. This wasn't about turkey. This wasn't about jokes. This was about a plan, whispered in her own home. She sat back in her chair, her fingers resting on the cool wood, her heart beating steady. Her face didn't break. Her breath didn't falter. She simply reached into her pocket, pulled out the notebook again, and added one more line beneath the first. Later overheard, "Brian, once she's gone, the house is ours." The ink dried quickly, but the words burned hotter than any fire she could remember. The morning after Thanksgiving, the house smelled faintly of cloves and pie crust, though the table was cleared and the dishwasher hummed its steady rhythm. Marjorie sat at the head of the table, the same place Brian had carved the turkey, and opened her small black notebook. Its cover was plain, its elastic band stretched from years of service, grocery lists, reminders, appointments. But now it had a different purpose. She smoothed the page with the flat of her hand, uncapped her pen, and began writing. November 23rd, Thanksgiving dinner. Brian. Don't break a hip reaching for the turkey. Witnesses: Elaine, Sophie, Gloria. Her pen moved again, slower this time, as if every letter weighed something. Later overheard from stairwell. Brian. Once she's gone, the house is ours. She underlined the sentence once, firm. Then she sat back, staring at the page. The words looked ordinary, ink on paper, but she knew they weren't. They were evidence. That afternoon, Sophie slipped quietly into the kitchen, while Elaine fussed over a leftover casserole. Her shoulders were rounded, her voice barely more than breath. "Grandma," she whispered, eyes wide and glassy, "I'm sorry for what he said." For laughing at the table, Marjorie touched her hand, gentle and warm. "You weren't the one who said it." "But I didn't stop him," Sophie admitted, guilt running through every syllable. Marjorie gave her hand a small squeeze. "One day you'll learn that silence speaks too. But for now, thank you for seeing me." The girl nodded, relief flickering across her face, before Elaine's voice called from the living room. "Sophie, help me with these dishes." She darted away, the moment sealed between them like a folded letter. By evening, Elaine had brushed it all aside. They sat in the den, the muted glow of the TV filling the silence, when Marjorie mentioned Brian's comment. Elaine waved her hand as though shooing away a fly. "Oh, Mother, you're just being sensitive. You know Brian. He cracks jokes." "You can't take everything so personally," Marjorie kept her face calm, but her notebook burned like a coal in her pocket. She didn't argue, she simply nodded, folded her blanket across her lap, and thought, "Then the notebook will have to speak for me." Later that night, Gloria stopped by, carrying her usual thermos of peppermint tea. She found Marjorie at the kitchen table, notebook open, pen in hand. "So it begins," Gloria said, dropping into the chair across from her. Marjorie tilted the notebook slightly so she could see the entries. Gloria leaned close, her breath sharp with mint. "Good. Write it all down, every word, every time. Don't trust memory. They'll call it imagination." Paper doesn't forget. Marjorie looked at her friend, then down at the ink, and gave a single nod. "It won't be just dinner anymore." From that night on, the notebook became ritual. Every insult, every sideways remark, every roll of Elaine's eyes went into it. Dates, times, names, each one a neat line pressed into paper. What had once been just a little habit of hers was now a weapon dressed in ink and margins. She kept it close, never far from her reach, tucked into her purse at bridge, folded into her lap at Sunday service, slid under her pillow at night. The weight of it steadied her, proof against the gaslight smiles and dismissive shrugs. Days passed, then weeks, the pages filled, neat rows of evidence stacking like bricks in a wall. And then one cold morning in December, she walked out to her mailbox, scarf tight against the wind, and sifted through the usual junk mail and catalogs. Nestled among them was an envelope stamped with the county seal. She tore it open on the porch, the air sharp and dry against her cheeks. Her eyes scanned the first line, and her pulse thudded once in her ears. Notice of deed transfer review. Margaret Coates' property. Her house. She stood in the cold, the envelope trembling in her hands, the words blurring for a second before they sharpened again. The deed. Under review. The letter sat heavy in Marjorie's lap, the county seal stamped dark against cream paper. Her hands, steady from decades of teaching handwriting and balancing ledgers, trembled now, not with weakness, but with clarity. She adjusted her glasses and read the words again, slower this time. Her throat went dry. She lived alone. Always had since Harold passed. No one else had ever signed on her deed. Her signature was her own. Yet here it was, Brian's name, typed neatly beside hers, as if ink could erase truth. She traced the signature line with her finger. Her name sat there in a curve she didn't recognize, as though someone had practiced her hand but missed the weight of her pen. It was almost hers, but not. A forgery. Marjorie folded the letter once, then again until the county seal disappeared into sharp creases. She slipped it inside her notebook, tucking it between the Thanksgiving entry and the scribbled notes from last week. Paper against paper, truth against lie. That evening, Sophie found her in the den, sorting through old hymnals stacked by the fireplace. The girl's voice carried the hesitation of someone who had overheard too much. "Grandma," she whispered, eyes darting toward the hallway. "Dad keeps saying the house is already his." Like, already. Marjorie stilled, her hands resting on the worn leather spine of a hymnal. "And how does he say it?" Sophie swallowed hard. "Like it's a done deal. Like he's waiting for you to, you know." She couldn't finish the sentence. Her cheeks flushed red. Marjorie reached out, brushing Sophie's hair behind her ear. Her voice was soft, but each word cut clean. "Don't carry his words for him, Sophie. Write them down instead. That way, he can't twist them." Sophie blinked, confused. "Write them down?" Marjorie tapped the notebook on her lap. "Words are heavier on paper than in air." Later, Gloria arrived with her usual brass-knuckle bluntness, plopping herself into the armchair beside Marjorie. The thermos of peppermint tea hissed as she unscrewed the cap. "You look like someone swallowed a wasp," Gloria said, eyeing her friend. "What's happened now?" Marjorie slid the folded county letter across the table. Gloria opened it, read, and her sharp intake of breath was louder than the kettle. "That boy," Gloria muttered, shaking her head. "He's building his future on your hip." Marjorie's jaw tightened. "Not if I can stop him." Gloria leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Then stop him. Don't let this sit. Fraud doesn't erase itself." The words lit something in Marjorie's chest. Not fire, but flint. A spark waiting for tinder. She reached for the phone on the side table, her fingers steady now. The county had provided a small line at the bottom of the letter. "For questions, contact Attorney Referral Service." She dialed, the old rotary phone clicking each number with deliberate finality. "Attorney Referral Network," a voice chirped through the line. "How may I help you?" Marjorie's own voice surprised her, clear, unshaking. "This is Marjorie Hale. I've received notice of a deed transfer I did not authorize. I need someone who knows how to deal with fraud." There was a pause. Then the voice softened. "We'll schedule a consultation. Do you have a preference for location?" "Downtown Omaha," Marjorie said. "Somewhere with walls that don't bend." Gloria grinned from across the room, raising her thermos in salute. Within minutes, the appointment was confirmed. A name was given. Thomas Reed. Tuesday at 10 o'clock. Marjorie wrote it neatly in her notebook, underlined twice, then closed the cover with a decisive snap. The house creaked in the silence that followed, but she didn't flinch. She had caught his hand in her pocket once. Now she had caught it on her deed. And next week she would place it on a lawyer's desk. The brass handle of Thomas Reed's office door was cool in Marjorie's grip, the kind of metal polished more by time than cleaning. She paused for a breath before pushing it open. Inside, the room smelled faintly of paper, ink, and strong coffee. The walls were lined with neat rows of binders, their spines labeled in blocky handwriting. Deeds, fraud, estates. A single clock ticked on the far wall, steady as a heartbeat. Thomas looked up from his desk when she entered. A tall man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and sleeves rolled up as though paperwork was physical labor. He stood extending his hand with a grip firm enough to ground her. "Mrs. Hale?" he asked. "Yes." Her voice was steady, though her stomach fluttered. She sat across from him, pulling the notebook from her purse and laying it flat on the polished wood. The leather cover creaked faintly as she opened to the first page. This is every insult, every date, every witness. And this, she said, sliding the county letter across the desk, is what it became. Thomas read silently, his brow furrowing as he traced the forged signature with his thumb. Then he glanced back at the notebook, flipping through pages that held Marjorie's neat cursive. "You've built your case already," he said at last, voice low with respect. "Most people walk in here with nothing but anger. You walked in with evidence." Marjorie folded her hands in her lap. "I was a teacher. Lessons are useless unless you write them down." Thomas leaned back, interlacing his fingers. "What your son attempted is called real estate fraud. It's a felony in Nebraska. Forgery, false representation, attempted theft. The fact that you caught it early means we have leverage." The words tasted both bitter and clean in Marjorie's mouth. Felony, forgery, theft. She had always thought of Brian as reckless, selfish. But criminal, that was something she had not yet named. Sophie, sitting quietly in the corner chair, finally spoke. Her voice wavered, but held. "If you need me to, I'll testify. I heard him. He said the house was already his. I'll say it in court." Marjorie turned toward her granddaughter, eyes softening. "You don't have to." "I want to," Sophie interrupted. "You've been carrying this alone." "I won't let him call you crazy." Thomas nodded approvingly. Spoken testimony like that, especially from a family member not tied to the estate, carries weight. Judges listen when younger generations speak against entitlement. Gloria, who had insisted on driving Marjorie downtown, leaned forward with her elbows on the table, her voice cut sharp, like scissors through fabric. "You're not weak, Marjorie. Don't let Brian's jokes sink into your bones. You're ready for this." For the first time in months, Marjorie felt the sting in her chest ease. She wasn't imagining things. She wasn't overreacting. She was preparing. Thomas slid a fresh sheet of paper into his typewriter, the keys clacking loud in the quiet office. "I'll file an injunction today," he said. "That freezes any attempt to alter the deed. The house remains solely yours until the investigation concludes. He won't be able to touch it, not legally." The words settled like bricks in Marjorie's chest, heavy but solid. She exhaled slowly, as if she'd been holding her breath since Thanksgiving. As they stood to leave, Thomas handed her a copy of the filing receipt. "Expect pushback. When people like your son realize the game isn't theirs to play, they make noise." Marjorie nodded. "Noise doesn't scare me anymore." The three women stepped out into the crisp air, the courthouse clock chiming noon above them. Marjorie tucked the receipt into her notebook, the leather cover closing like armor around it. That evening, as she stirred a pot of soup on her stove, the phone rang. Its shrill tones sliced through the small kitchen. She wiped her hands and lifted the receiver. "Mother," Brian's voice was sharp, clipped, every syllable laced with anger. "You think you're clever? Having me served at my office like a criminal? Do you have any idea what you've started?" Marjorie gripped the phone tighter, her eyes drifting to the notebook resting on the counter beside her. She didn't answer yet. She only let the silence stretch, taut and deliberate, until it cut sharper than words. The pen hovered above the paper like a blade about to drop. Marjorie's hand did not tremble. She signed her name in slow, deliberate strokes, the ink dark and final. When she lifted the pen, it felt heavier than it had before. Not because of fatigue, but because of what it carried now: freedom. Thomas Reed slid the signed will toward the notary, who stamped it with a firm metallic click. The sound was like a door slamming shut on decades of expectation. "Mrs. Hale," Thomas said, his voice low but steady, "this is airtight. No contest clause included. If Brian or Elaine tries to challenge it, they forfeit everything, even the symbolic." Marjorie nodded, her eyes not leaving the paper. For years she had lived in the quiet rhythm of compromise, smoothing conflicts the way she smoothed wrinkles from tablecloths before holiday dinners. But this was different. This was her table, her rules, her future. She looked to Sophie, who had insisted on joining. The girl sat upright, her hair pulled into a loose braid, her palms pressed together in her lap like she was praying without words. When Thomas slid the summary copy across the desk, Sophie leaned closer, reading the lines with wide eyes. "Grandma," she whispered, you really did it?" Marjorie allowed herself a small smile. "I told you, dear." I was listening when he laughed. I was listening when he whispered. Now the paper listens too. The details were clean, precise, undeniable. Brian and Elaine, cut out completely. Their names erased from the ledger like chalk washed from a board. Sophie, sole heir with protections until 25. No early access, no loopholes, no vultures waiting to swoop. And then Marjorie's quiet flourish. A portion of her estate diverted to the Richmond Community Kitchen, where she had ladled soup every Thursday for 20 years. Thomas tapped the clause with his finger. "No contest. This is the lock on the door. If they push, they lose. If they accept, they still lose." Gloria, perched on the window seat, let out a sharp laugh. "Good. Let them choke on their own greed." Marjorie closed the folder, the edges of the paper whispering against the leather. She slipped the signed will into the very center of her notebook. Between the page where she had written July 9th, $40 missing, and the page where she had written county letter, deed fraud attempt, the notebook grew thicker, heavier, stronger. It was no longer just memory. It was her shield. By the time she left Thomas's office, the late afternoon sun had dipped low, throwing gold light across the courthouse steps. Each stair she descended felt lighter, as if the weight she had carried had shifted from her shoulders into the pages of her notebook. That night, back in her kitchen, she brewed chamomile tea and let the steam brush her face. Sophie sat at the table, tapping a pencil against her notebook from school. "Do you feel different?" Sophie asked softly. "Yes," Marjorie said, stirring her cup. "For the first time in years, I feel like the future is mine, not theirs." Gloria raised her mug from across the table. "To broken chains." Marjorie clinked her cup against it. The tea tasted sharp, like medicine she hadn't realized she needed. Later, when Sophie left for the night, Marjorie carried the notebook upstairs to her bedroom. She tucked it into the drawer beneath her nightgowns, locking the brass handle with a key she wore on a chain around her neck. The lamp cast a warm circle of light across the quilt, and for a fleeting moment, she felt safe. But safety, like silence, could be fragile. It was nearly midnight when she awoke to the creak of wood. Not the wind, not the settling of the house. A drawer sliding open, she held her breath, listening. A faint shuffle, a pause. Then the unmistakable sound of paper being disturbed. Marjorie pushed herself up slowly, her pulse loud in her ears. Through the sliver of hallway light leaking under her bedroom door, she saw the shadow move, smaller than Brian's, narrower. Elaine. The silhouette bent over her desk in the study, rifling through drawers with frantic, jerky movements. Every scrape of wood against wood was like a match being struck. Marjorie clutched the key at her neck, her lips tightening. The will was safe, but Elaine didn't know that. Not yet. And as Marjorie watched, her silence turned to strategy. Elaine's fingers fumbled through the desk like a burglar who'd lost the map. The bottom drawer groaned as she tugged it open, the air puffing with the faint smell of cedar and dust. Paper rustled. Not the legal kind, not the kind she wanted, but handwritten cards, yellowed clippings, recipes in Marjorie's looping cursive, chicken pot pie, plum preserves, Sunday stew. Her irritation cut through the room in sharp, shallow breaths. Marjorie stood in the hallway, unseen, the brass key to her real secrets, warm against her chest. The will, the deed records, the notebook with every insult and theft. All of it was locked far from Elaine's hands in a safe deposit box across town. Elaine pawed through index cards, as if gravy stains could unlock her future. Finally, Elaine slammed the drawer shut, the sound jolting the silence like a dropped pan. Marjorie retreated into her room without a sound, slid beneath her quilt, and listened to Elaine's heels clicked quickly down the stairs. The front door closed with a hollow finality, but the echo lingered. The next morning, Sophie's voice carried a weight it hadn't before. She sat at the kitchen table, picking at the corner of her toast. "Grandma," she said, eyes darting away. "Mom keeps saying, you'll be in a home soon, that it's safer for you." Marjorie set down her teacup. Steam curled upward, blurring her face in the light. She didn't snap, she didn't sigh. She only asked, "And what do you think, Sophie?" "I think you're sharper than half the adults in this house," Sophie said, her cheeks flushed. "But Mom says you don't remember things." Marjorie smiled faintly, the kind of smile that was both shield and dagger. "If I didn't remember, Sophie, how would I know the difference between soup stock and fraud?" Gloria arrived later that day, bringing her usual bluntness with a bag of apples. She dropped them onto the counter with a thud. "They're circling," she muttered, peeling off her gloves. "Like crows. First the deed. Now Elaine digging through your drawers." They're waiting for a stumble. Marjorie pulled out her notebook, flipping past neat lines of dated entries. "That's why the record matters," she said. "Paper is steadier than memory." Gloria cut an apple slice, crunched loudly, and said, "Then let's make sure they never call you frail in front of a judge." That evening, Marjorie sat across from Thomas in his book-lined office. The air smelled faintly of ink and leather. He flipped through her most recent notes, brow furrowing. "They're escalating," he said. "This isn't just entitlement anymore. They're setting groundwork to challenge your capacity. If they succeed, they'll control everything. You won't get a say in where you live, how your money's spent, even who visits you." Marjorie's hands rested calmly in her lap, but her eyes narrowed like a hawk's. "Then what's the counter?" Thomas leaned forward. "A medical competency evaluation, voluntary, independent. If you do it now, before they file anything, we'll have ironclad evidence. Doctors, paperwork, signatures. No one can twist that." Gloria's words replayed in Marjorie's mind. "They're circling. Yes. But circles could be broken." "Schedule it," Marjorie said firmly. Thomas made the call with practiced efficiency, booking an appointment for the following week. "It won't be pleasant," he warned. "They'll test memory, judgment, decision-making. But you're strong enough. More importantly, you're ready." Marjorie nodded once. "Let them measure me. They'll find steel, not cracks." When she returned home, Sophie lingered in the doorway of her room. "Grandma," she whispered. "Mom was on the phone with Dad. She told him, 'You already put the house in my name.' He said, 'Then it's time to push.'" Marjorie touched Sophie's cheek lightly. "Don't be frightened by their noise. Wolves bark loudest when they're hungry." That night, she slipped the notebook beneath her pillow. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't comfort, it warns. She closed her eyes, but her body remained tense, braced. The warning arrived the next morning, not with a knock, but with a courier's envelope shoved into her mailbox. Thick, official, embossed with county seal. Inside, bold letters sprawled across the page. Petition for guardianship. Filed by Brian Hale. Claim. Diminished capacity of Margaret Hale. Marjorie's breath left her like a blade drawn clean. The house around her seemed to still, the air heavy, the silence deliberate. She folded the paper once, then again, slid it into her notebook, and whispered to herself, "They think they're the storm, but they just lit the match." The courthouse air was sharp with polish and old varnish, the kind of smell that clung to corridors where secrets had echoed for decades. Marjorie's heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she walked beside Thomas Reed, her attorney. She didn't hurry, didn't drag her feet. Her steps were measured, steady, almost defiant. Each one said, "I am not fragile. I am not yours to control." Inside, the courtroom hummed with murmurs. Brian sat stiffly at the petitioner's table, his tie too tight, his jaw clenched as though he'd bitten down on stone. Elaine sat behind him, lips pursed, eyes darting toward Marjorie like daggers sharpened in silence. Sophie, seated quietly near Gloria, gave her grandmother a small, steady nod. Judge Harmon adjusted his glasses and glanced at the file in front of him. This matter concerns the petition for guardianship over Margaret Hale, filed by her son, Brian Hale. We will hear arguments and review evaluations. Brian shot to his feet too quickly, chairs screeching against the floor. Your Honor, my mother has become forgetful. She misplaces bills, struggles with names, and refuses help. She insists on living alone despite her declining health. I'm only trying to ensure she's safe. His voice was smooth, almost practiced. But his eyes betrayed something harder, something hungry. Thomas rose slowly, sliding a folder across the table with calm precision. We intend to prove not only that Mrs. Hale is fully competent, but that this petition is not about safety. It's about control. The first witness called was Dr. Emery, the court-appointed physician. He adjusted his spectacles, flipped open his notes, and spoke with crisp authority. I conducted a full cognitive assessment of Mrs. Hale last week. She passed every test: short-term memory, long-term recall, executive function, problem-solving, all intact. In fact, her results are above average for her age group. Brian's knuckles whitened against the table. She forgets things, he barked. Dr. Emery shook his head. There is no medical evidence of dementia, confusion, or diminished capacity. In my professional opinion, she is fully competent to manage her affairs. The judge made a note, his pen scratching softly against the page. Next came Sophie. She stood hesitantly, her hands trembling as she raised them to be sworn in. She glanced at Marjorie, who gave the slightest nod of reassurance. Sophie's voice wavered at first, then steadied. My dad. He says things when he thinks no one is listening. He told Mom that once Grandma's gone, the house is ours. He told me that Grandma doesn't need her money because she's too old to use it. And he said, her throat tightened. He said if she doesn't hand it over, they'll make sure someone else decides for her. Gasps rippled softly through the courtroom. Gloria's sharp eyes cut straight into Brian, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Thomas rose again, his tone calm but edged. Your Honor, what you've just heard isn't concern for an aging parent. It's entitlement masquerading as guardianship. He laid out the notebook entries Marjorie had kept. Dates, quotes, even screenshots of posts Brian thought had disappeared into the ether. This is a pattern of behavior. Not a son protecting his mother, but a son circling her assets. Brian leapt up, face flushed red. She's manipulating everyone. Sit down, Mr. Hale, the judge interrupted firmly. His gavel tapped once. This court isn't here for theatrics. The room stilled. Finally, Judge Harmon removed his glasses and looked directly at Marjorie. Mrs. Hale, I've reviewed the medical evaluation, your attorney's filings, and your granddaughter's testimony. I see no evidence that you are unable to manage your affairs. The petition for guardianship is denied. Permanently, the gavel cracked down, sharp and final. Relief swept through Marjorie, not like a flood but like a stone lifted off her chest. She turned to Sophie, who was already blinking back tears, and gave her the faintest smile. Gloria leaned in and whispered, That's checkmate, dear. But the victory was short-lived. As the courtroom emptied, Brian lingered near the aisle, his voice a low growl meant only for Marjorie's ears. His breath smelled faintly of coffee and bitterness. If she won't give it, he hissed, his lips curling into something darker than a smile. We'll take it another way. Marjorie didn't flinch, but her hand closed tighter around her notebook. The words came out of Brian's mouth like gravel scraping against steel. His voice was low, venom tucked beneath every syllable, but not low enough. Sophie had been standing in the kitchen doorway, phone angled down by her hip, its camera dark but its microphone wide awake. Once she slips, once she can't keep track of the paperwork, we'll force her out, Brian muttered to Elaine, who stood with arms folded, nodding like a metronome. Guardianship didn't work, fine. But there are other ways. Power of attorney, pressure. She won't fight forever. Sophie's hand shook, but she kept the phone steady. She knew her father's tone, the way it coiled before it struck. And this time, she wasn't going to let his words vanish into smoke. Later that night, in the safety of Marjorie's den, Sophie slid the phone across the table. "Grandma, listen." The recording spilled out, Brian's growl filling the quiet room. Each word was proof, undeniable, ugly, and deliberate. Marjorie's fingers tightened on her teacup. She didn't cry, she didn't shout. She simply reached for her notebook and wrote a new line in her clean cursive. March 2nd, audio recording. Brian. "We'll force her out." Witness, Sophie. Then she looked up at her granddaughter and nodded once. "You did right." The next morning, Thomas Reed's office smelled of coffee and cold rain. Marjorie set the phone on his desk, her notebook beside it. Thomas plugged in a small speaker, and Brian's voice filled the room like a storm cloud. When the recording ended, Thomas leaned back, a slow smile curling at the edge of his mouth. "This," he said, tapping the phone, "is not concern. This is coercion, and courts don't take kindly to it." "What happens now?" Sophie asked, her voice small but steady. "Now," Thomas said, "we file for a temporary restraining order. If he so much as looks at you the wrong way, he'll be violating court orders. You've built your case piece by piece, Marjorie. And now he's given you the nail for his own coffin." By Thursday afternoon, Judge Harmon signed the order. Brian was to stay 50 feet from Marjorie at all times, barred from contacting her directly or through proxies. The ruling felt like a shield settling across her shoulders. When Gloria came by that evening, she grinned wide, a thermos of black coffee tucked under her arm. "You've got him tripping now," she said, plunking herself down on Marjorie's couch. "Men like Brian don't stumble well. They thrash. They fall louder than they walked in." Marjorie gave a thin smile. "I only wanted peace." "Peace sometimes comes after war," Gloria said, pouring coffee into 2 chipped mugs. "You're winning yours." But peace wasn't what Elaine wanted. By the weekend, the neighborhood grapevine buzzed like summer cicadas. Elaine's voice carried through book club meetings and grocery store aisles. Marjorie's slipping, Sophie's confused. Gloria's stirring trouble. None of it's true, but you know how families get. Marjorie heard the whispers when she went to pick up her prescriptions. She felt the pitying glances, the hesitant greetings. But she also noticed the clerk behind the counter, young, bright-eyed, who handed her the bag with a firm, "Good for you, missus." Hale. Not everyone believed Elaine's poison. Some people knew the difference between truth and performance. That night, Marjorie sat in her armchair, notebook open on her lap. Her pen hovered above the page for a long time before she wrote, "Rumors spreading, Elaine's hand in them. Let them talk." She closed the notebook and pressed her palm against its cover, steady and sure. Pride wasn't something she wore loudly, but it glowed beneath her skin now, quiet, unshakable. The phone rang just as she set the notebook aside. "Mrs. Hale?" The voice on the line was clipped, professional. "This is Karen from First Fidelity Bank. We're calling to confirm a large withdrawal request made earlier today on your account." It flagged as unusual. Marjorie froze. Every nerve sharpened to a point. "What amount?" she asked. $9,500, the woman said. "Requested by someone claiming to be your son." The line went silent for a beat, broken only by the faint hum of the receiver. Marjorie's voice was calm, but her heart beat like a drum inside her chest. "Decline it." And put a block on every account. Effective immediately, her hand reached for her notebook again. Flipping to a fresh page, this time her pen didn't shake at all. The call still echoed in Marjorie's ears. $9,500, nearly her entire savings, almost drained in a single stroke of arrogance. She sat at her kitchen table, the rotary wall clock ticking above her head like a metronome for her thoughts. Outside, the afternoon sun made the tulips bend heavy. But inside, every shadow felt sharpened. The bank had blocked the attempt. That was victory, but victory didn't feel light. It felt heavy, like carrying a shield that must never drop. She opened her notebook, turned to a clean page, and wrote in her careful script. March 4th, fraud attempt. Withdrawal request $9,500. Reported by bank. Suspect. Brian. The ink bled slightly on the page. Permanent. Unerasable. By ye eye. The time she sat across from Thomas Reed the next morning, the attorney already had a thick folder in hand. Mrs. Hale, he said, adjusting his glasses. They weren't just greedy. They were reckless. Brian left a digital fingerprint the size of a billboard. The bank recorded every keystroke, time, date, even the IP address of the device he used. Marjorie let the words soak in. So he wanted me penniless. Thomas leaned forward, his voice low and measured. He wanted you dependent. There's a difference, and dependence is power. Marjorie pressed her palms flat on the polished oak desk. Then I'll take that power back. It didn't take long. That afternoon, Thomas filed for restitution. Every cent Brian had attempted to siphon, plus penalties. The courthouse clerk shuffled papers, stamped forms, and sent the case into the system with the quiet efficiency of a machine. The wheel was turning now, and Brian couldn't stop it. At home, Sophie perched on the edge of the sofa, knees pulled close. Her voice hushed but fierce. He's desperate now, Grandma. I've never seen him like this. He's snapping at Mom. He's slamming doors. Marjorie brushed her granddaughter's hand. Desperation doesn't last long. It burns itself out, Gloria, dropping by with her usual clatter of bangles and sarcasm, snorted. Or it breaks something. She plopped down in the armchair and sipped from her ever-present thermos of coffee. And honey, that sound you're hearing, that's the sound of breaking. The three women sat in the living room, silence folding between them. For once, Marjorie didn't feel small against Brian's scheming. She felt armored. Every document, every line of ink, every witness. Her notebook had become her fortress. A week later, she stood inside the county courthouse again, the fluorescent lights casting their pale glow over wood-paneled walls. Judge Harmon, his spectacles perched low, glanced between the filings. The matter of Hale versus Hale, restitution hearing scheduled for April 14th. Brian, seated 2 rows behind her, couldn't contain himself. This is ridiculous. She doesn't know what she's talking about. His voice cracked with the kind of panic he tried to dress as outrage. The bailiff shot him a warning glance. The judge didn't even blink. Mr. Hale, you will have your time to respond. Until then, the accounts remain locked, and under the petitioner's sole authority, Marjorie sat straighter in her seat. Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, didn't tremble. After the gavel came down, she left the courthouse with Thomas at her side. He murmured, "This isn't just about the money anymore. This is about credibility. He tried to rob you, and now the court knows it." Marjorie's eyes lingered on the courthouse steps, as though each stone was another rung up the ladder of her reclamation. "Good," she said. "Let them all know." But truth didn't. Quiet Elaine. It was 2 days later, at the grocery store, when the simmer finally spilled. Marjorie had just placed a carton of eggs in her basket when she heard the hurried tap of heels against tile. She turned, and there was Elaine, face pale, hair mussed, hands clutching her purse strap like a lifeline. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Elaine hissed, voice cracking loud enough to turn heads in the cereal aisle. "We're broke because of you." Every shopper froze. A toddler in a cart stopped mid-giggle, staring at the woman unraveling in public. The hum of the freezer units filled the silence that followed. Marjorie didn't speak. She simply blinked once, slowly, and shifted her basket from one hand to the other. Elaine's chest heaved, her words tumbling out jagged and raw. "You ruined us!" And the aisle, suddenly, was smaller than it had ever been. The whispers reached Marjorie before she ever opened her front gate. At the bakery, Mrs. Lawson tilted her head in pity, asking if she needed help carrying bread home. At church, someone slipped her a pamphlet about assisted living. Even the postman, usually brisk, lingered a little too long, his smile stretched thin as though testing her coherence. Elaine's handiwork was spreading fast. Senile, confused, losing her grip. A woman too frail to handle her own house, her own accounts, her own life. Marjorie stood in her kitchen, hands folded on the counter, the scent of rosemary and chicken broth thickening in the air. She didn't curse or cry. Instead, she reached for her calendar, flipped to Saturday, and wrote 3 words in blue ink. Dinner. My house. By Friday, invitations had been made, not with fanfare, but with quiet calls. "Why don't you stop by for supper?" she'd said. 7 sharp. Bring nothing but yourself. No excuses were offered, and none were accepted. On Saturday evening, the dining room glowed. The table was laid with pressed linens, china polished until it gleamed, and Marjorie's roast chicken resting in the center like a statement piece. The smell of garlic and butter braided through the air, pulling her guests into warmth. When the neighbors arrived, Mr. and Mrs. Porter, the Lawsons, and even young Kelly from across the street, they found Marjorie not shuffling or stammering, but moving with easy grace. She poured wine without spilling a drop, cracked jokes that made the Porters laugh until they clutched each other, and cut the chicken with hands steady as oak. Elaine's lies unraveled one sentence at a time. At the midpoint of dinner, Sophie slipped into the conversation, her voice soft but sure. "Grandma's been writing everything down," she said, pulling the leather notebook from her bag. She laid it open on the table, its pages neat with dates, quotes, and signatures of witnesses. Every word, every slight. Nothing's been forgotten. The room hushed. The notebook glinted in candlelight. Not loud, not dramatic, but powerful. Proof bound in ink. Mr. Porter cleared his throat. "Well, I'll be," he said. "That's sharper than anything I've seen from Brian or Elaine." Gloria, of course, couldn't resist. She smacked her palm on the table and barked a laugh. "Case closed at the table. Who needs a courtroom when you've got roast chicken and a notebook sharper than a scalpel?" The laughter that followed wasn't cruel. It was freeing. Every rumor Elaine had planted seemed to wither in that moment, starved of oxygen. After dinner, neighbors lingered, offering hugs, promises, and even written notes, confirming what they'd witnessed that night. Thomas collected them one by one, slipping the affidavits into a folder thickening by the day. His eyes gleamed with approval. "They've given us more than defense," he murmured to Marjorie as he stacked the pages. "They've given us testimony." Marjorie nodded, the faintest smile tugging her lips. "Let Elaine gossip. I'll serve truth by the plate." It was near midnight when the last candle flickered out and Sophie carried dishes into the kitchen. Marjorie, tired but not weary, leaned against the counter. She could still hear Gloria's laughter echoing, see the comfort in her neighbor's eyes. For once, she didn't feel like prey. But morning brought another sound. A heavy knock at the door, the kind that carried weight, not courtesy. Marjorie opened it to find a uniformed courier, his gloved hand holding a cream-colored envelope stamped with the seal of the county court. "Mrs. Hale?" he asked. She signed for it, thanked him, and shut the door with deliberate calm. At the table, she slit the envelope open with her paring knife. Court summons. Estate hearing. Final ruling set. The words stared back at her in black ink, unflinching. The date was circled in red. The last battle was now on the calendar. The echo of her cane against marble floors was louder than she expected. Sharp, deliberate, like punctuation at the end of each step. Marjorie entered the courthouse lobby with her chin lifted, coat buttoned neatly, and notebook tucked into her leather bag. The air smelled faintly of old varnish and coffee that had been sitting on a burner too long. When she stepped into the courtroom, Brian was already there. He leaned back in his chair, one arm slung lazily over the backrest as if it were his throne. His smirk widened when he spotted her cane. "Careful, Mother," he murmured, loud enough for the first row to hear. "Don't want you tripping on the way to the witness stand." Marjorie didn't respond. She walked past him without a glance, steady as a soldier crossing enemy ground. Her cane tapped once, twice, then planted firmly as she took her seat beside Thomas Reed. Thomas leaned toward her, his voice low and calm. He wants a reaction. Don't give him one. I wouldn't waste the energy, Marjorie whispered back. The judge entered, and the room rose. Silence settled like a weight when everyone sat again, broken only by the scratch of the clerk's pen. Case of Hale versus Hale, the judge announced, her voice clipped and cool. Allegations of fraud, coercion, and attempted guardianship without cause. Counsel, proceed. Thomas stood, buttoning his jacket with unhurried precision. He began with the notebook. Page after page, he laid out the insults, the threats, the forged deed attempt. His voice was steady, his phrasing precise, each detail landing like a nail hammered into wood. The neighbors' affidavits were presented next, followed by the recordings Sophie had captured. The audio filled the courtroom. Brian's voice, sharp and venomous, hissed through the speakers. We'll force her out. She won't know what hit her. Brian shifted in his chair, his earlier smirk faltering. Sophie took the stand next. Her hands trembled at first, but her voice grew stronger with each word. I watched my grandmother write everything down. I heard my father threaten her, and I can tell you she hasn't forgotten a single thing. She's stronger than any of us, Brian barked a laugh, trying to cut her down. Oh please, she's just a kid. Mr. Hale, the judge snapped, eyes narrowing. You will remain silent unless spoken to. The courtroom stilled. Brian sank back in his chair, jaw tight. Marjorie kept her gaze on Sophie, pride swelling quietly in her chest. Her granddaughter's words rang louder than any insult Brian had ever flung. Thomas concluded with a letter, the county's notice of the attempted fraudulent deed transfer, signed proof of Brian's interference. He placed it carefully on the judge's bench, his eyes meeting hers for a moment that said, "It's all here, all of it." The judge leaned back, steepling her fingers. She didn't look at Brian. She didn't look at Elaine, who was sitting rigid in the second row. She looked at Marjorie. "Mrs. Hale," she said softly, "do you have anything you wish to say before I deliver my ruling?" Marjorie rose, cane steady, shoulders squared. The room held its breath. "Only this," she said. "I was mocked in my own home. I was told I was weak, forgetful, disposable. But I stand here with every step accounted for, every word written, every lie exposed. I may walk with a cane, but I do not stumble." The judge's eyes flickered, a spark of respect passing through them. She nodded once. Brian started to speak again, but Thomas raised a hand, silencing him with nothing more than presence. The judge tapped her pen on the desk. The sound echoed like a drumbeat. "I've heard enough," she said. "I will deliver my ruling." The judge's pause felt heavier than any gavel strike. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on her as she shuffled the papers on her bench, her glasses catching the light like a blade. For a moment, no one breathed. Even Brian's restless tapping stilled. Finally, Judge Drake spoke. The evidence presented is overwhelming. The notebook, the affidavits, the recordings, and most telling, the fraudulent deed transfer. It is my ruling that full ownership of the property remain exclusively with Mrs. Marjorie Hale. A wave of air seemed to leave the courtroom all at once, the sound of relief escaping Marjorie's chest as she closed her eyes. She didn't move, didn't gloat, didn't so much as twitch, just held her cane firmly in her hand and listened. As for the attempted bank withdrawal, the judge continued, her voice firm as steel, Mr. Brian Hale is ordered to repay in full the attempted loss to the financial institution. Restitution is hereby set, along with court costs. Brian muttered something under his breath, but the bailiff's sudden step toward him silenced it. Elaine's hand shot out to grip his arm, but even she looked pale now, her lips drawn tight as twine. And lastly, the judge said, adjusting her glasses, the temporary restraining order against Mr. Hale is hereby extended for 2 years. Any violation will result in immediate contempt of court and possible incarceration, the gavel struck. Crack, sharp, final. For the first time that day, Marjorie let herself exhale fully. Her shoulders dropped an inch. Beside her, Thomas slid the papers into his briefcase with quiet satisfaction. Brian stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the tile. His face was red, jaw tight, eyes darting around as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, his voice cracking. "She's just an old woman." The judge's glare cut him off mid-sentence. "Enough." The word rang louder than his protest. Sophie, sitting behind Marjorie, couldn't hold back anymore. She rushed forward the moment the gavel echoed its last note, wrapping her arms around her grandmother. "You did it," she whispered fiercely, her cheek pressed against Marjorie's shoulder. "You really did it." Marjorie lifted one hand, trembling slightly, and patted Sophie's back. Her eyes burned, but no tears fell. Not here, not in front of him. Gloria stood near the aisle, arms folded, her grin sharp enough to slice. "Justice served hot," she quipped. Her words drew a ripple of relieved laughter from the back of the courtroom, the first sound of warmth in hours. Thomas adjusted his tie, his calm unshaken. "Grip broken," he said quietly to Marjorie, almost like a benediction. "He doesn't have a hold anymore." Marjorie nodded, steady. "Not on me." "Not on this house," Brian tried to storm out, Elaine trailing after him, whispering harshly in his ear. They didn't look back, not once. When the room began to empty, Marjorie stayed seated, cane across her knees, notebook pressed against her palm like a victory she didn't need to flaunt. Sophie leaned close, whispering, "Grandma, everyone saw the truth today." "Good," Marjorie murmured. "Truth holds longer than rumors." The courthouse steps were bright in the afternoon sun. The winter air smelled sharp, carrying the faint scent of roasted peanuts from a vendor down the street. Marjorie felt the light on her face and let it stay there, her chin lifted. She wasn't hiding anymore. That evening, as she sat at her kitchen table with Gloria and Sophie, the newspaper lay folded neatly between the teacups. The headline stretched bold across the front page. "Widow defends home from son's exploitation." Marjorie smoothed the paper with one hand. She didn't smile, but in the silence, her steadiness was louder than triumph. The pen scratched across the final page, a sound so faint it might have gone unnoticed, but to Marjorie, it was thunder. She sat in Thomas Reed's office, the desk polished to a mirror sheen, paper spread like a map of her life. The smell of leather bindings and faint ink filled the air. When she lifted the pen, her hand shook only slightly, not from doubt, but from weight. Thomas slid the page toward him, eyes sharp behind his glasses. "That's it. The trust is finalized. No ambiguity, no backdoors." Marjorie folded her hands in her lap. "And the conditions?" "They stand," Thomas said, tapping the document. "Sophie inherits when she turns 25, not before. Education protections are secured, tuition, housing, essentials, and the community kitchen receives equal partnership in your estate. No one can contest this without risking disinheritance under the no contest clause, Gloria." Sitting at Marjorie's side, sniffed once and pressed a tissue to her eyes. "I thought I'd seen everything, but this..." She shook her head, voice trembling. "You're turning your life into meals for people who need them." "That's the kind of legacy that outlives granite headstones." Marjorie gave a faint smile. "My legacy feeds others, not greed." Thomas leaned back, satisfied, and reached for his notary stamp. The metallic press thunked against the page, final and permanent. "There it is," he said, "sealed." Sophie sat quietly at the corner of the office, hands twisted in her lap. Her eyes, rimmed with the faintest pink, lifted to her grandmother's face. "I don't deserve this." "You don't," Marjorie said softly, then reached across the desk to cover Sophie's hand with her own. "But you will earn it. That's what matters. You saw me when no one else did." "That's enough to start." Sophie blinked hard, nodding as if committing the words to memory. The office clock ticked, the steady sound filling the space, while Thomas organized the copies. Marjorie took the moment to breathe in the silence. to feel what it was like when her choices weren't dictated by fear, but by resolve. For, once she wasn't reacting to Brian's latest cruelty. She was building, brick by brick, the future she wanted her name tied to. Gloria broke the quiet. "You've done it, Marge. You've taken their claws off you." Marjorie shook her head slightly. "Not claws, Gloria. Expectations. They're sharper because they pretend to love while cutting." A silence fell again, heavier this time, before Thomas cleared his throat. "There's one last matter. Do you want your son notified immediately, or shall I wait until after your passing?" Marjorie didn't hesitate. Silence is notice enough. Let him learn it when the world already knows. Thomas gave a small, approving nod. Then we're finished. When they left the office, the winter air felt fresher, colder, sharper, like it had been waiting for her. Snow crunched under her boots, the flakes drifting from a pale gray sky. She inhaled deeply, tasting the clean chill. Sophie slipped an arm through hers as they walked toward the car, steadying her not because Marjorie needed it, but because she wanted to. That night, Marjorie sat at her kitchen table with Gloria, the documents stacked neatly in a folder before them. Gloria poured tea into chipped china cups, steam curling upward in thin ribbons. "You feel lighter?" Gloria asked. Marjorie considered, her gaze fixed on the folder. "No, I feel planted. Like I've put roots down in the right place." Gloria raised her cup. "To roots that outlast weeds." They clinked gently, the sound small but solid. Later, when Sophie hugged her grandmother goodnight and the house finally quieted, Marjorie sat alone in her living room. The lamplight washed over the framed photograph of her late husband. She whispered, "We built this place with love. It will leave with love, too." Her eyes caught movement at the window, the mail carrier slipping an envelope through the slot. She rose, cane clicking against the hardwood, and picked it up. The return address was Brian's. Her chest tightened, but she opened it anyway. The paper inside was scrawled, angry ink slashing across the lines. "You'll regret this." Marjorie held it in her hand a moment, then folded it neatly and slipped it into the notebook labeled Evidence. Her lips curved, not in fear, but in readiness. The paper trembled in Marjorie's hands, not because she was afraid, but because the ink itself seemed to vibrate with venom. Brian's handwriting was harsh, jagged slashes that gouged across the page. "You'll regret this. You've ruined everything. You'll die alone, and the house will rot around you." The words carried no wit, no cleverness, only raw spite. They smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, as if the stench of his bitterness had soaked into the envelope before it reached her. She sat back in her chair, the letter stretched open on her lap. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the mantel clock. For a moment she allowed herself to feel it, not the fear he intended, but the weight of his desperation. Then she folded the paper slowly, precisely, as though she were sealing a contract he didn't realize he'd already lost. Marjorie rose, cane steady, and crossed to the fireplace. The logs inside had been waiting since morning, laid carefully on kindling with a neat stack of matches resting on the hearth. She struck one, the sulfur hissing to life, its sharp scent filling her nose. She touched the flame to the edge of the paper. The fire licked eagerly. First the corner curled, then the ink dissolved into blackened edges. A line of orange raced across Brian's words until they were unreadable, unrecognizable. Ash broke away and fluttered upward like gray moths trying to escape. She watched it all, eyes steady, hands unshaken. When the last scrap crumbled into the flames, she spoke aloud, voice low but clear. "That's the only answer you'll get from me." Behind her, Sophie had been standing silently, watching. Her arms were crossed, but her expression wasn't hard. It was searching. When the last ember of the letter disappeared, Sophie finally stepped forward. "Best answer you could give," she whispered. Marjorie turned, the firelight flickering against her face. "I thought so." Sophie leaned closer, lowering her voice. He wanted a reaction. "You didn't give him one." Marjorie let the silence between them serve as confirmation. She didn't need to explain what she'd just done. The fire spoke for her. Later that afternoon, Gloria arrived with her usual blunt energy, a tote bag swinging from her shoulder. She sniffed the air the moment she stepped inside. Something smells sweeter than usual. The last of Brian's letter, Marjorie said simply. Gloria's mouth twitched into a grin. Silence is louder than shouting, Marge. That ash is a whole speech. They sat together at the table, cups of tea steaming, the faint smoke from the fireplace still curling faintly in the air. Sophie placed the folder of finalized documents on the table between them, her hand lingering on the cover. Thomas called. It's done. All registered, all sealed. There's nothing left for them to grab at. For the first time in weeks, Marjorie leaned back in her chair, the tension in her shoulders easing. I'm finished with his grip, she said, each word deliberate, a statement she intended to carve into the air. Gloria raised her cup in a toast. To being untouchable. Sophie clinked hers softly against it. To being free, Marjorie lifted her own. To being unbreakable. The three of them drank, and the warmth of the tea sank deeper than the heat of the fire. A warmth born of certainty, not fear. Night fell quietly. Marjorie retired to her room, folding away her robe at the foot of the bed, slipping beneath the quilt. She slept soundly, no longer haunted by the shadows of what Brian might try next. He had already failed. The following morning, she found Sophie waiting at the kitchen table, a wrapped package in her hands. Her cheeks were flushed, eyes nervous but hopeful. I wanted you to have this, she said, sliding it across the table. Marjorie unwrapped the paper slowly. Inside was a wooden frame, simple but polished, holding a piece of parchment with a single word written in bold script. Unbreakable. Her throat tightened. She traced the word with one finger, the grooves of the ink pressed deeply into the paper as if carved there. She looked at Sophie, her voice quiet but strong. I think I'll hang this over the fireplace, where he tried to burn me down. And as she set the frame upright on the mantel, the fire below it whispered back in soft crackles, carrying the ash of Brian's threats into nothingness. The frame caught the morning light, as if it had been waiting for this exact spot. Marjorie lifted it with careful hands, the polished wood smooth against her palms, and hung it squarely above the mantel. Unbreakable. The single word gleamed in bold ink, casting a kind of armor over the room. She stepped back, Khan balanced at her side, and for the first time in months, her shoulders lowered. The air felt lighter, as though she had opened a window no one could close. Sophie leaned against the doorway, her smile shy but proud. It looks like it's always belonged there. Marjorie turned, studying her granddaughter, no longer the timid girl who once whispered apologies at the dinner table, but someone standing taller, steadier, eyes bright with quiet fire. So do you, Marjorie said. Sophie's cheeks flushed. She crossed the room and slipped an arm around her grandmother's shoulders. I learned from the best. The house hummed with a different kind of silence now. No whispers of schemes, no threats shoved into envelopes. Only the rustle of newspaper on the porch and the kettle whistling in the kitchen. When Gloria arrived that afternoon, her sharp eyes immediately darted to the mantel. Well, would you look at that? She stepped closer, squinting at the word, then back at Marjorie. Fitting, your walk is steadier too, you know. Like a woman who doesn't need a cane, but carries one just to remind the world she's in charge. Marjorie chuckled softly, settling into her armchair. Maybe it's the truth weighing less these days. Gloria plopped down opposite her, crossing her legs with the satisfaction of someone who had watched a battle from the first drumbeat to the victory march. Or maybe it's that you finally cut the rotten limb off the family tree. Later in the week, Thomas stopped by, briefcase in hand. He wasn't in his usual courtroom suit, but a sweater and coat, looking almost casual, though his eyes still carried the precision of a man who lived in paperwork and statutes. He placed a folder on the table and tapped it once. Everything is sealed now, he said. The deed is yours. The trust is active. The will is airtight. Not even the sharpest knife could cut through this. He leaned back, folding his arms. Your estate is untouchable. Marjorie reached for the folder, not to open it, but to rest her hand on it as though it were a heartbeat. That's what peace feels like, she murmured. Thomas gave her a small smile. Funny thing about peace, you don't realize how heavy the fight was until you set it down. Sophie sat nearby, notebook open, her pen tracing idle doodles on the margins. She looked up. Grandma, can I keep this one when you're done with it? She lifted the notebook slightly. It feels like history. Our history, Marjorie's eyes softened. You'll have it. All of it. So you'll never forget what silence can do when you write it down. The fire crackled. The house smelled of apple pie cooling on the counter, cinnamon and butter swirling with the faint smoke of oak logs. Marjorie sat straighter in her chair, her cane resting neatly beside her, not as a crutch, but as a companion. She looked at each of them, Sophie, blooming with confidence, Gloria, fierce and loyal, Thomas, steady and certain. For the first time, she felt surrounded not by threat, but by testament. My hip, she said, smiling wryly, is strong enough for this walk. Gloria raised her teacup. To walking lighter, Sophie lifted hers too. To writing it down, Thomas added. To closing every door they tried to pry open. Marjorie held her own cup aloft, the steam curling upward like a promise, to being unbreakable. The cups clinked, a sound sharper than any gavel, more binding than any oath. Outside, autumn leaves skittered across the porch, chased by the wind. Thanksgiving loomed on the calendar once more, but this year the weight of it no longer pressed on her chest. She wasn't dreading the table. She wasn't bracing for barbs disguised as jokes. She had rewritten her ending, and as she looked once more at the frame glowing in the firelight, she whispered her own quiet verdict. Not to Thomas, not to Gloria, not even to Sophie, but to herself. At Thanksgiving, my son said, "Don't break a hip reaching for the turkey." So I broke his grip on my estate.